Dante Morelli did not stop because he was merciful. He stopped because trauma had suddenly taken human form in front of him. Elena, his dead brother's widow, the woman left to drown in the wreckage of his empire, was standing in the rain with nothing left to lose. And Elena did not move toward him because she trusted him. She moved because long suffering can twist survival into surrender, until even danger starts to look like shelter. What follows is not a rescue, but a brutal collision between guilt and grief, manipulation and need, where the real question is not whether they can face the truth, but whether the truth will destroy them both first.
Case Study 1. The subject, Dante Morelli, observes from his idling vehicle like a predator in deep water. He monitors his brother's widow as she undergoes total social degradation on the sidewalk. She attempts to liquidate her marital history for $20, completely unaware of the megalomaniac narcissist nearby. Morelli recognizes that gold. It was a gift to the sibling he interred 6 years ago. Eleanor Whitmore once functioned as a high-status consort. She is now merely human wreckage resulting from the subject's own machinations. The repressed guilt within Morelli is beginning to breach the surface. Observe closely as these two psyches collide. Please indicate your current location in the feedback section. The Brooklyn environment is saturated under a dark sky, with pavement reflecting like liquid obsidian. Inside the cabin, Morelli maintains the rigid posture of a cold, ambitious architect. He has a criminal empire to manage and blood-stained ledgers to reconcile before the clock strikes 12. The driver, Romano, makes a navigational error into a decaying urban wasteland. Under a failing structure, a female specimen shivers in the darkness. Suddenly, the vehicle's internal climate triggers a psychosomatic chill against Morelli's skin. She appears as a blurred configuration of bone and saturated fabric, a specter in the downpour. Her hair adheres to her face like dead vegetation. She fixates on her own palms, her hands exhibiting tremors so severe they suggest a total physical breakdown. She offers a metallic fragment to passing shadows, but the environment remains unresponsive. In that vacuum of empathy, her ego finally collapses. It is the specific sound of a human psyche reaching its terminal point at the junction of hopelessness. Pattern recognition strikes Morelli with the force of a projectile. He issues a sharp command for the vehicle to cease movement. He exits before the rotation of the tires stops, his luxury outerwear absorbing the filth of the street as he approaches the shivering entity. He maintains a tactical distance of 5 feet. She elevates her gaze, revealing a complete ocular void. Her eyes are hollow, showing the bruising of 1,000 nights of sleep deprivation. It appears Elena has returned from a state of social death. He vocalizes her name like a religious ritual, but she perceives only a predatory threat. Recognizing his silhouette, she instinctively protects her jewelry and attempts to flee, but her physical reserves are a spent match. Immobilized against the freezing masonry, she suffers from acute respiratory distress. Morelli extends a hand, but she reacts with a flinch typically reserved for a weapon. This is not merely a reaction to the temperature, it is the vibration of pure autonomic terror. He inquires about her socioeconomic collapse, but his words are lost in some ire. She emits only a dry, fragmented laugh. It is the auditory signature of a subject who abandoned all theological hope years ago. She discards her psychological mask and identifies him as the primary agent of her slow expiration. These accusations penetrate deeper than any ballistic trauma. Morelli stands paralyzed, a monument of salt dissolving in the torrential rain. He questions the duration of her residency in the gutter. She refuses eye contact, her jaw clenched against a scream she refuses to externalize. "Long enough," she retorts, categorizing his pity as just another form of psychological assault. She retreats with a limp into the darkness, resembling a damaged bird in a gale. Morelli's internal shadow urges him to let the environment reclaim her. It would be logistically simpler to allow her to vanish once more. "Please," he vocalizes, the word sounding dissonant and foreign in his throat. She halts. When he asks for the narrative of her downfall, his tone adopts a human frequency for the first time. She rotates toward him, her eyes saturated with profound grief. She provides the clinical truth. He was the catalyst that ignited her life. For 6 years, Morelli sheltered behind his power, but in her presence, his psychological fortress turns to dust. He directs her toward the sedan. She remains a skeletal figure in a saturated garment, yet she finds the internal resistance to stay rooted. She refuses to move a single inch toward the man who engineered her ruin. Even as her consciousness fades, her verbal responses remain sharp. She mocks his sudden impulse to adopt a savior persona. How can the individual who constructed the trap pretend to be the deliverer? She asks if he has any concept of the topology of hell. She lost everything because he decided she was a negligible variable. She surgically deconstructs him with her words, and he offers no defense. He offers no verbal apology for his transgressions. He simply repeats the command to enter. He almost desires a physical strike, a tangible manifestation of her hatred to anchor his ego to the physical world. She demands a rationale for his concern after years of clinical silence. He makes no attempt to simulate holiness. He simply states that he finally sees her, and that visual data is permanently etched into his psyche. Elena finally experiences a psychological rupture. She gazes at that thin gold band, the final remnant of her former self. She whispers that its value was intended to purchase only 3 or 4 more days of existence. The reality of her situation hits with the force of a hammer. That ring was the phantom of her husband, and she was bartering it for $20. The horror of this transaction exceeds any logical calculation. "Get in," he dictates. She scans for a tactical trap, then submits to the inevitable. However, she establishes a clear boundary. Her compliance does not constitute a pardon for his previous crimes. Inside the vehicle, the atmospheric pressure is almost suffocating. She huddles against the door, attempting to minimize her physical presence. Morelli grants her the only concession he can: total silence. As the thermal systems activate, her tremors intensify. Romano requests a destination. Morelli observes this hollowed organism, searching for any traces of the vibrant woman she used to be. He recalls the brilliant intellect his brother once cherished. Now she is a ghost. When he declares they are moving toward his residence, she enters a state of acute panic. She pleads for a sanctuary or even a cold floor, anything but his home. She claims her suffering is her private property. But Morelli has finished negotiating. Her survival is now inextricably linked to his. Her resistance finally expires. She presses her head against the window and whispers her hatred. Morelli does not react. He accepts the statement like a judicial sentence he fully deserves. For 20 minutes, they traverse a neon-lit vacuum. Elena appears as a fading photographic record. Morelli sits beside her, silently performing the mental math required to maintain her life. They arrive at his massive stone estate. She remains catatonic in the seat. He instructs her to exit, his voice low and authoritative. She perceives a prison, but she has reached the end of her choices. Her motor functions nearly fail on the stone steps. Morelli guides her into the cavernous silence of the main hall. The artificial lighting casts long, tragic silhouettes across the floor. She stands motionless, dripping environmental runoff onto his expensive flooring. He indicates the guest quarters and the bathing facilities. She stares into the void before disappearing into the shadows of the upper floor. She delivers one final lethal look before vanishing. Morelli finally exhales, his chest feeling as though it were filled with lead. He retreats to the kitchen to seek a grounding task. He assembles a basic meal: bread, cheese, and poultry. He traverses his own hallways like a phantom, haunted by the woman he attempted to purge from memory. Elena is the single casualty his logic cannot justify. She is the sibling's widow, the asset he sacrificed for the organization's stability. He maintained the necessity of this choice for 6 years, but now the silence is screaming in his ears. He signals at the door, presenting a plate. Her voice sounds as if it is emanating from a burial chamber. She is seated on the bed, wrapped in a towel, her saturated hair resembling weeping willows. She appears as fragile as glass in the dim light. When he offers the nourishment, she claims a total lack of appetite. He leaves the food and indicates a wardrobe of clothes she will likely never utilize. Her expression of gratitude is as cold as a grave. When he attempts to close the distance, she terminates the interaction. She views herself as a transient, merely waiting for the sun to escape his gilded cage. He inquires about her future destination, but the silence is profound. Elena looks at the meal, her pride engaging in a struggle with her hunger. Consuming his bread feels like a betrayal of the man she loved. Primal biological needs finally override her spite. She consumes the bread, her eyes stinging with salt. 10 minutes of raw survival pass, leaving only the shadow of the man they both destroyed. Shivering under silk sheets, she experiences a flashback to the funeral where he stood like an indifferent marble deity. Behind a wall of guards, he ignored her bereavement entirely, leaving her to drown in his silence. His security detail discarded her like waste. He reclaimed his golden throne, while she retreated to a freezing room and insurmountable debt. Her life flatlining alongside Marco's final, labored heartbeat. After 6 years of clinical neglect, he now adopts the mask of a protector. A jagged laugh escapes her as she sinks into the luxury. Escape is a theoretical dream, but the heat is a snare, and the storm outside offers only a grave. She experiences fragmented sleep, while below he tastes whiskey that reminds him of ash. A hidden compartment opens, revealing his ledger of transgressions. One entry from 6 years ago dominates the page. Marco is dead. The subject, a high-functioning sociopath, utilized fratricide as a strategic maneuver. Dante sacrificed his own kin for the organization, exhibiting a complete lack of effective empathy as he observed the execution. Marco's death was merely a collateral settlement for his brother's pathological narcissism. A sensory trigger induces a dissociative episode. The subject is grappling with the betrayal of his primary attachment figure. He utilizes alcohol to suppress the resulting cognitive dissonance, attempting to find psychological equilibrium within a domestic environment constructed upon his own traumatic history. Circadian rhythms return her to a state of hypervigilance. The environmental stimuli, the precipitation, the symbolic loss of the jewelry are processed with clinical precision. She presents symptoms of depersonalization, viewing herself as an intrusive element while preparing to interact with her designated tormentor. The environment displays a stagnant, tomb-like atmosphere. The dominant male utilizes a communication technique, a written note, to establish a false sense of security. By leaving the perimeter unsecured, he employs a sophisticated psychological gambit, testing her internal constraints within a luxury-laden detention center. Despite an available exit, the subject displays a paradoxical attachment to the environment. The degraded state of the garden serves as a projection of her own internal decay. She is experiencing a profound identity crisis, mirrored in the necrotic organic matter around her. The arboretum is a silent necropsy of a former life. The subject perceives the desiccated flora as a metaphor for neglected psychological needs. She identifies with the starving vegetation, projecting her own desire for emotional nurturance onto the dying landscape. He maintains a position of voyeuristic dominance while she performs manual labor in the mire. His high-status attire serves as a barrier, emphasizing the power imbalance. He remains a detached observer as she attempts to symbolically resurrect a maternal figure through physical exertion. A flat effect dominates the interaction. The environmental degradation began 5 years ago, coinciding with the maternal loss, a trauma that induced a permanent emotional freeze in the subject. They are two manifestations of grief standing in a wasteland of calcified memory. The patient reacts with hostility toward his sudden altruism. His intense ocular fixation suggests a shift in focus. He acknowledges a profound moral deficit, conceding that basic physical comfort cannot mitigate 60 or 70 months of psychological abandonment and deliberate isolation. He attempts a white knight intervention, which she identifies and rejects as a condescending ego fix. She refuses to be the instrument of his moral absolution. The kingpin is temporarily stripped of his perceived authority, revealing a fragile, decompensated ego. The concept of atonement creates a heavy atmospheric tension. Upon witnessing his genuine emotional distress, her defensive boundaries fracture. She articulates a cold realization she is not a therapeutic tool intended to repair his fragmented psyche. They establish a transactional pact based on mutual suffering rather than reconciliation. They agree to a codependent existence within the structure. They are functionally ghosts, haunting a residence that is only now beginning to show signs of psychological activity. The scorched earth serves as a laboratory for their shared traumas. The initial phase is characterized by avoidant behavior. Elena manifests as a phantasm, skillfully navigating the hallways to avoid the architect of her original psychological fracture. The dominant male maintains a respectful distance, avoiding direct confrontation. His behavior is highly ritualized, leaving before sunrise, returning after sunset. Their verbal exchanges clinically efficient, a sterile performance of social necessity conducted in a frigid, emotional climate. A brief interaction regarding sustenance highlights the ongoing power struggle. He attempts to grant her agency by offering keys, yet she perceives this as a psychological trap. By the eighth night, the sustained tension reaches a breaking point, resulting in a sudden verbal rupture. The preparation of food triggers a regression to old-world patterns. She displays a startled response upon his entry and utilizes a lie as a defensive mechanism. Her feigned apathy is a transparent attempt to mask significant somatic tremors and acute anxiety. A fragile behavioral baseline is established. He performs a minor act of submission by removing his necktie. She remains in a catatonic-like state of silence, her movements mimicking the mechanical actions of an individual relearning basic social integration. He experiences a sensory shock from her culinary output, which contains deep cultural markers. His attempt at positive reinforcement triggers a fearful reaction in her. She utilizes minimization as a defense, though the emotional investment in the task is clinically evident. She experiences a brief flooding of traumatic memory related to her mother. The subject observes the vocal tremors indicative of deep-seated grief. She rationalizes the situation by suggesting her maternal figure would have found a redemptive quality in this morbid setting. She identifies the garden as a potential site of maternal sanctification. Her obsession with the soil is identified as a grounding technique, a desperate attempt to maintain psychological integration and prevent a complete dissociative break. She questions his motivations with a sarcastic inquiry into his professional role. He defines himself as a witness to her suffering. A minute micro-expression of a smile appears, even as she nihilistically declares the environment beyond the point of rehabilitation. Restoration requires an immense capital investment. He offers an unlimited budget, framing the expenditure as a historical reclamation rather than a direct purchase of her loyalty. This is a strategic move to bypass her defensive rejection of charity. She analyzes him with the intensity of a predator before accepting the terms. She demands total autonomy, which he grants. The cessation of the meal leaves a residual tension where overt hostility begins to evolve into a complex shared pathology. He engages in a behavioral role reversal by performing menial labor. This subversion of status leaves her in a state of cognitive shock, He maintains a rhythmic focus on the task, his gaze constantly tracking her presence like a trained observer. She is observed fixating on a photographic record of the deceased. Her grief is directed toward the pre-trauma version of the brother. Dante's proximity suggests a shared fixation on a past where the familial structure was still intact. He recounts the divergence of their paths at age 22. Marco's aspiration for a legitimate legal career was sabotaged by the subject's need for control. She processes this confession of systemic destruction with a look that is surgically sharp. Under interrogation, he admits to the predatory grooming of his own brother. He required a trusted intellectual asset and deliberately ensnared him in the criminal enterprise. It is a textbook case of sociopathic exploitation for organizational stability. He displays signs of a total ego collapse, admitting his narcissism was the catalyst for their downfall. She highlights his emotional blunting at the funeral, the absence of tears. He is left in a state of profound verbal paralysis, unable to offer a restorative narrative. Chronic remorse has become his baseline state. He acknowledges that the mansion is merely a luxury-lined vacuum. He makes a significant emotional disclosure. Her continued existence is the only stimulus providing him with a sense of purpose. The subject's psychological facade finally disintegrates. He reveals the inciting incident, witnessing her desperation as she sold her wedding ring for $20. This observation of her absolute degradation broke his clinical detachment. Observing her psychological unraveling triggered a shift in his behavioral objectives. He has abandoned the pursuit of moral redemption, focusing instead on her survival. He is willing to maintain his role as the villain if it ensures her continued vital signs. He accepts the mantle of the antagonist with a chilling stoicism. She retreats into avoidant behavior. However, by the next morning, she provides a list of tools, a clear sign of her returning to the grounding activity of manual labor. He fulfills her logistical requirements with zero friction. Within 48 hours, the property is inundated with supplies. She observes the arrival from an elevated vantage point, adopting the persona of a military commander preparing for a reclamation project. A nocturnal meeting occurs in his office. He preemptively rejects any financial reimbursement. To him, currency is a meaningless abstraction. He is seeking a reduction in his overwhelming psychological debt, not a monetary transaction. The only fee he mandates is the restoration of the flora. She attacks the soil with an animalistic intensity, a behavior indicating she is using the labor to restitch her fragmented psyche through a physical medium. By sunset, she is covered in the detritus of her labor, yet shows signs of increased neurological arousal. He attempts an intervention at 9 o'clock, offering hydration as a means to interrupt her obsessive-compulsive focus on the task. She accepts the fluid, but refuses to disengage from the labor. The soil has become her primary coping mechanism, a sanctuary within a high trauma zone. He recognizes this frantic need and seeks to understand the architecture of her self-administered therapy. She describes a preference for hardy, resilient species capable of surviving extreme conditions. This selection is a clear projection of her own survival instinct. The garden is the only barrier preventing a total, catastrophic mental collapse. He physically descends into the mire with her, seeking to understand her motivation. She admits this is her only domain of absolute agency. Her history was written by others, but in this 1 acre, she exercises total executive control over life and death. She has assumed a god complex over this small territory. He encourages this development, urging her to cultivate an identity that is entirely decoupled from male influence, a rare moment of altruistic encouragement from a manipulative personality. The psychological mending process is estimated to take decades. She emphasizes the temporary nature of her stay. They view the location differently. For him, it is a permanent stronghold. For her, it is a transitional facility on the path to total autonomy. She asserts that her eventual departure is inevitable. He views this as a systemic tragedy, while she views it as the only viable outcome. She clarifies that she is not a broken object in need of repair, rejecting his attempt at savior status. Despite the stated intent to leave, she remains trapped in a repetitive daily cycle. They exist like celestial bodies in a cold, fixed orbit. The silence between them at the dinner table is dense with unspoken traumatic material. Their communication remains superficial, focusing on meteorological and horticultural data. However, clinical observation suggests a significant internal tension. They are physically bound by the architecture, but psychologically isolated by light years of unresolved conflict. She eventually gravitates toward the library, a high-density information environment she previously avoided. It is a sanctum of intellect and leather, a hidden cognitive world contained behind a single, massive barrier. The subject arrests upon discovering a primary artifact, a text from 2015. Marco's handwriting functions as a cognitive residual, transforming this space into a clinical reliquary for a decedent's psyche. The primary subject emerges, framing the decedent's literary fixation as a Faustian psychological transaction. The female exhibits an acute emotional rupture, mourning over the fragmented intellectual remains of the victim. She queries the retention of these trauma-linked items. He admits an inability to purge evidence of the deceased's biological existence. These volumes represent the final structural fragments of a fractured fraternal bond. The decedent suffered from profound internal dissonance, an aesthetic temperament forced into a violent behavioral paradigm. Dante initiates a symbolic reconciliation, transferring access via a relic stained by ethical and physical violence. He applies the ultimate psychological stimulus regarding the decedent's fixation, causing a total mental collapse. Under low luminosity, she seeks sensory contact with the victim's past, experiencing a haunting cognitive presence. Attempting psychological recovery proximal to a recent fatality produces a sensation of respiratory and existential constriction akin to breathing through a burial shroud. Upon exiting her quarters, she observes the subject fixated on archaic documentation, his facial affect displaying a cynical and bitter enlightenment. Elena critiques his ritualistic behavioral patterns, categorizing his existence as a state of living biological decay, despite continued cardiovascular function. While the subject engages in chemical self-administration with liquor, the female systematically deconstructs his cognitive distortions with surgical verbal precision. He projects a facade of executive stability, yet the subject observes the gradual encroachment of a dark, depressive psychosis consuming his mental faculties. Utilizing 16-hour shifts serves as a defensive barrier against internal auditory distress and the intrusive memories of past trauma. She systematically bypasses his emotional defenses, exposing a core that underwent profound psychological necrosis many years ago. A transient moment of interpersonal warmth occurs before she executes a sudden withdrawal, reestablishing a state of profound social isolation for the subject. At 2 a.m, his nocturnal wandering continues until the female subject provides a necessary navigational anchor for his return. 2 trauma-damaged individuals establish a fragile state of homeostasis amidst the psychological wreckage of their shared environment. The subject expresses a somber, clinical gratitude for her refusal to adopt a deceptive social persona during their interactions. Though he avoided the formal interment ritual, the psychological obligations of the deceased have returned to demand a final accounting. He exhibited avoidant behavior, attempting to suppress the reality of his violent history and the profound emotional deficit within his psyche. The female subject's persona fails. She demands access to the objective reality concealed behind his elaborate curtain of fabrication. In a sociopathic cost-benefit analysis of power, Dante exchanged his sibling for territorial gain, ultimately yielding a net-zero psychological profit. No amount of ritualistic violence or accumulated wealth can compensate for the fraternal bond the subject discarded for strategic advantage. The olfactory hallucination of betrayal renders the immediate atmosphere toxic, turning the oxygen into a metaphorical residue of ash. Exposure to objective truth causes acute psychological laceration, prompting her flight from the subject's remaining hollow physical form. She regresses into a state of social invisibility, emerging from her isolation only to fulfill basic nutritional requirements for survival. Utilizing nonverbal communication and peripheral tasks, she maintains a ghostly presence within the subject's operational environment like a lingering memory. The subject is currently being overwhelmed by the narrative history he failed to expunge from his cognitive record years ago. He treated the decedent as a fungible asset for trade, only to discover the acquisition possessed zero intrinsic psychological value. A minimalist physical acknowledgement precedes his departure. The subject is a man systematically preparing for total social erasure. She observes his physiological and mental decline, vocalizing resentment toward the hubris that catalyzed their current state of devastation. 72 months of deception confirmed the decedent functioned merely as a disposable unit in the subject's megalomaniac strategic maneuvers. She rejects basic sustenance while he exposes the desolate, frigid landscape of his internal psyche for her clinical observation. The subject presents zero justification, maintaining catatonic-like stillness during her externalized emotional discharge and torrential verbal aggression. He queries her lack of flight, observing the manifestation of Stockholm Syndrome, the invisible psychological tether she chooses not to sever. Elena remains anchored to this site of trauma, incapable of articulating the gravitational forces maintaining her proximity to the wreckage. Mutual suffering provides the sole point of interpersonal contact as he attempts to integrate her into his own suffocating psychological descent. Despite expressing revulsion toward their shared bond, both subjects maintain a fragmented, subvocal dialogue centered on their mutual trauma. Absolution is clinically impossible. She requires only the structural documentation of the systemic destruction that reduced their world to ash. Dante struggles with internal pathologies, while Elena demands a raw, forensic examination of their tragedy, seeking data over any form of solace. Recognizing her unwavering resolve, he capitulates. In his private workspace, he retrieves an archival volume documenting his comprehensive history of ethical failures. He highlights the decedent's data, cautioning that the information is cognitively toxic. Her manual tremors indicate a profound and instinctive autonomic fear response. The documentation bears marks of chronic remorse. She mandates his presence as her psychological structure collapses into a state of acute agitation. The script exhibits signs of high-stress dysgraphia. Vittorio's operatives executed a swift extraction costing 3 lives and $2 million in under 2 hours. Within a 72-hour window of absolute authority, he prioritized systemic power over kinship, fearing empathy would trigger a total structural collapse. He maintains a cold effect during this high-stakes manipulation. By the 48th hour, the victim disappears, and the subject's psychological integrity fails. As the temporal limit approaches, he seeks contact via a non-functional channel. Depleted and terrified, he maintains the facade until the final breakdown. The visual evidence is a clinical study in profound trauma. The subject, Marco, was discarded at the docks like biological waste, his facial features completely obliterated. The autopsy confirms a psychological cruelty. He expired 48 hours into his abduction, rendering the subsequent negotiations a macabre exercise in managing a corpse. Internalized shame is the primary pathogen here. The subject prioritized his criminal hierarchy over familial survival. For years, he maintained a complex delusional structure for Elena, a manufactured reality designed to prevent the total psychological collapse he knew the truth would trigger. At the interment, his inability to maintain eye contact indicates a severe deficit in emotional regulation. He attempted financial restitution, but she rejected the blood money as a toxic stimulus. Consequently, he shifted into a predatory state, systematically eradicating the Vittorio lineage with cold, sociopathic precision. 90 days post-retribution, the Vittorio syndicate is a non-entity. The subject achieved his objective, yet the victory provides zero dopamine. The dead remain dead. Elena's emotional state is characterized by a heavy, leaden despair as she attempts to close this traumatic chapter. Somatic symptoms are surfacing. Her tremors are involuntary and persistent. As her perceived reality is dismantled, the subject remains in a catatonic-like state of stillness. She articulates a fatalistic rationalization for the victim's death, which the subject validates with a silent, clinical acceptance of his culpability. The subject's narrative may be a protective confabulation necessary for psychic survival. He maintains a voyeuristic, unblinking watch over her. He acknowledges the futility of speculating on financial intervention, resigning himself to the permanent consequences of his executive decisions. He identifies himself as the primary catalyst for the execution. Elena is currently a high-risk emotional volatile. She externalizes her vitriol, using him as a lightning rod, yet this verbal purging provides a morbid sense of relief. The agonizing period of cognitive dissonance has finally concluded. The oppressive atmosphere begins to dissipate. The subject displays zero defensive posturing during her interrogation. When pressed, he admits his grandiose narcissism led him to believe he could exert total control over unpredictable variables and fate. She classifies him as a complete psychological failure. Elena's behavior mirrors that of a caged predator, restless and aggressive. She dismisses his admission of error as an insufficient remedy for permanent loss. When he probes for a baseline of comparison, his tone is unsettlingly detached. Her response is a high-decibel emotional discharge regarding his lack of empathy. He maintains an analytical distance, viewing her outburst as a mathematician would view a bad debt. She is desperately seeking a hostile reaction to fuel her own internal combustion of rage. She craves a shared conflagration, but finds only his cold, stoic resignation. Eventually, the subject's controlled exterior suffers a catastrophic breach. The kingpin archetype collapses, replaced by a raw, obsessive compulsion to rectify a chronologically irreversible trauma. He is experiencing persistent auditory and visual hallucinations of his brother. He recognizes the pathological trade-off. He sacrificed human connection for corporate expansion. His vocal cords finally betray his distress as he confesses that his arrogance was the architect of his own ruin. The confession is finalized. The environmental tension is palpable, almost viscous. Elena articulates her inability to reside within the architecture of her husband's executioner. He offers a formal acknowledgement, though his lack of insight into the systemic rot suggests a lingering cognitive gap. She rejects the role of a fugitive. She seeks refuge in the library, a sanctuary for cognitive reintegration. Her eventual departure will be a deliberate, autonomous action, signifying a shift in power dynamics where she, not he, controls the threshold. She is engaged in a process of psychological remapping. His passive surrender acts as a fresh irritant. She desires a dynamic conflict, mockery, or supplication to validate her anger. However, he remains committed to her total agency in this transition. The subject abdicates his position of authority. He acknowledges that his deceptive behavior regarding Marco's expiration revoked his leadership status. He has transitioned from an apex predator to a hollowed-out vessel, a mere suit without a soul. This is not absolution, but a preliminary moral audit. She signals the end of the interaction, retreating to her quarters. Their final exchange, a gratitude for the truth, and his admission of her prior right to it, functions as a formal transfer of psychological property. He is left in the penumbra of his own documented failures. By dawn, the atmospheric pressure has shifted toward stabilization. She discovers the former patriarch in a state of domestic incompetence, struggling with basic tasks like a disoriented child. She uses dark humor to break the tension. He displays a significant startled response, having assumed her departure was already executed. In a moment of total vulnerability, the man who managed a global syndicate admits he is defeated by a simple kitchen stove. His primary motivation was a basic nurturance ritual for her. This primitive kindness penetrates her defensive layers. For the first time, a micro-expression of a smile appears. They establish a non-verbal cooperative rhythm over a mundane request for salt. Observe the behavioral shift. The active hostility has entered a dormant phase. They participate in a quiet commensal meal. When she proposes a horticultural project, the Dawn offers manual labor, a surprising gesture of submission, which she tentatively accepts. Exhaustion has softened her boundaries. The criminal mastermind agrees to discard his formal armor to assist her. Observing this monster in civilian attire is a surreal, hallucinatory experience for her as he literally grounds himself by digging into the earth. She issues directives with the macabre metaphor, linking the act of burial to the act of cultivation. They achieve a rare state of flow in the manual labor. As the light recedes, the interpersonal conflict is replaced by the silent, rhythmic, synchronized movement of work. They are both physically marked by the soil. She offers a backhanded compliment regarding his temporary humanity, which he meets with self-deprecating wit. Her psychological fortifications are showing signs of structural erosion. The dialogue shifts to a deeper retrospective analysis. He queries her about her systemic collapse following the funeral. She describes it not as an acute trauma, but as a death by 1,000 cuts, a slow thermal erosion of her entire existence. It was a textbook downward spiral, professional loss followed by housing instability, and then the theft of her assets by the organization. Her own social circle treated her as a pariah, using her misfortune as a dumping ground for their collective guilt. She was surgically removed from her social support systems. Her journey through the shelter system stripped her of all personal resources. She articulates the poverty trap, the paradoxical need for stability to gain life and life to gain stability. She became a ghost. Her hopelessness was absolute. The subject is visibly burdened by this retrospective data, but she denies him the catharsis of an easy forgiveness. 6 years of systemic torture cannot be erased, yet they have achieved a necessary clearing of the air. The subsequent weeks show a marked increase in vital energy. Their evenings are dedicated to transforming a barren plot into a structured aesthetic triumph. She functions as the executive architect, he is the labor. Together, they are constructing a tangible reality. While he manages the logistics of his criminal enterprise, she focuses on her own rehabilitation. Her urban excursions are characterized by the hypervigilance of a traveler returning to a forgotten homeland. Elena is successfully reestablishing her internal equilibrium. She presents complex horticultural schematics, planning for seasonal cycles and winter dormancy. He monitors her ocular patterns. They are no longer fixed on past trauma, but are scanning the future horizon. He interprets this as a potential long-term commitment. He scans her for a verbal contract, but she remains enigmatically silent. Despite the lack of an overt oath, her behavior indicates she has rooted herself in this environment. In the silence, the subject experiences a desperate sub-threshold hope that manifests as physical ache. This is a nocturnal manifestation of their shared neurosis. Neither can achieve restful sleep. She finds him submerged in administrative data well past midnight. Both subjects are trapped in a temporal loop, awaiting a resolution from a past that no longer exists. She probes his capacity for remorse. He confesses to a profound, daily self-loathing regarding his violent vocation. He characterizes himself as a predator built for a cage, an apex hunter who has lost the ability to exist outside of a confined, dangerous reality. A significant developmental trauma is revealed. He was forcibly inducted into the leadership role at 19. Marco's past observations suggest the Don possessed an artistic temperament. His manual tremors increase as the suppressed identity of the artist momentarily surfaces in his eyes. A fraternal betrayal acted as a psychic ligature, strangling his creative drive. 2 decades have passed since he engaged in artistic expression. She challenges his survival mode existence, urging him to undertake the painful, complex process of actual emotional vitality. He is captivated by her sudden cognitive clarity. She attributes this to her prolonged period of social isolation and silence. This perspective was not a gift for him. It was a self-administered psychological antidote to prevent her own bitterness from becoming a terminal toxicity. The environment begins to smell of chemical solvents and creative potential. Under the cold light of a lamp, the subject begins to manifest his internal world through art. She observes from the threshold, a witness to a man undergoing a radical psychological molting, a rebirth. She withdraws, leaving him to his process. There is no clinical cure for their history, but the psychic weight has decreased. They are learning to navigate the geography of their trauma without allowing it to dictate their future trajectory. The internal conflict has reached a stable, if fragile, state of homeostasis. As the flora begins to emerge, she tends to them with a monastic devotion. They have spent weeks preparing this substrate for a literal and metaphorical resurrection. He observes from the periphery, documenting her likeness in his sketches. He maintains a self-deprecating narrative that he is incapable of fostering growth. She responds with a genuine, unforced laugh, a rare break in her clinical exterior. They have reached a symbiotic equilibrium. She is the intellect. He is the force. She recounts a maternal warning about the spiteful nature of roses. He observes her, recognizing that her beauty is inseparable from her defensive, thorny resilience. He posits that she is a product of the same unyielding environment as the flowers. Her laughter is sharp and incisive. Marco's assessment was accurate. She was the only one with the psychological fortitude to remain upright amidst the rubble of their world. Correctness is not a substitute for victory, she asserts with a flash of her former intensity. Dante observes the emergence of his brother's muse, and his own defensive psychological armor begins to show irreversible structural failure. Elena is driven by a diagnostic hunger for Marco's final truths. Dante begins a deep dive into his own mental archives, retrieving the fragmented memories of the woman who functioned as his brother's beautiful, catastrophic obsession. Psychiatric logs document a baseline of cognitive fragmentation and affective lability during public screenings. While engaging in manual labor, her facial micro-expressions reveal a suppressed dopamine response to canine-themed media. He categorized her behavior as a domestic whirlwind, accompanied by involuntary melodic vocalizations. When prompted for the auditory source, Dante exhibits a mirroring cognitive deficit regarding her erased chronology. The auditory phantom of a maternal hymn remains, a wordless cadence of primal attachment. They engage in a temporary cessation of hostilities, marked by the ritualistic planting of 6 saplings. Elena anticipates horticultural failure, yet Dante observes the earth with a prophetic intensity. In this pathology of violence, projecting a future bloom is a radical deviation from the family's terminal patterns. Under a nocturnal shroud, Elena discovered a clandestine record concealed within the legal archives. This was no criminal ledger, it was a psychological cartography of Marco's internal disintegration and spiritual drowning. Collapsed in a state of shock, she absorbs the documentation with a desperate, starvation-like intensity. The narrative charts his moral decay until the acute moment of limerence that redefined his identity. He observed her in a gallery, a vision in arterial red, neutralizing an adversary with a single verbal incision. Marco's ego surrender was immediate, a man defeated before even establishing a linguistic connection. He revisited that gallery 3 times, exhibiting a compulsive attraction to a lethal stimulus. Dante, the primary strategist, monitored these excursions to determine if this obsession was a manageable liability. Following a protracted silence, the authority figure issued a formal endorsement, commodifying her as a high-value asset. Elena now exhibits profound emotional instability, trapped between hysteria and phantom grief. The documentation then takes a clinical, heavy turn. Dante attempted a transition to legitimacy, but Marco realized that a psychological sanctuary cannot be constructed upon a foundation of systematic trauma. Marco's ego eventually fractured. Elena's response was a hollow, catatonic silence rather than vocal distress. Dante utilized family preservation manipulation to reassimilate his brother into the organizational collective. It was a sophisticated, malevolent deception. The promises of rehabilitation were fraudulent, and the hierarchy's hunger only intensified. Marco remained, tethered by a codependent need to share his brother's descent. The atmospheric tension became frigid the final 72 hours. Dante urged a retreat, but Marco reclaimed his agency for a single night, refusing to fail his primary attachment again. A routine meal was transformed into a terminal sacrifice. Elena is devastated by the realization that he knowingly embraced his execution just to maintain a 1-hour delusion of domestic normalcy. The conclusion is clinical. Marco was not a victim of circumstance, but the architect of his own catastrophe. He chose the psychological weight of the crown over a safe, distant shoreline. Dante discovers her with the record, and his rigid emotional defense shatters completely. Seeing his own malignancy reflected in the victim's handwriting creates an intolerable mirror that exposes his systemic failures. Elena remains in a state of emotional anesthesia as Dante verbalizes his guilt. He had engineered a psychological cage of perpetual debt disguised as fraternal love to ensure Marco's eternal proximity. Dante confesses to weaving a web of deception to mitigate his own isolation. However, Elena rejects the simplified villain narrative. She recognizes that Marco consciously accepted his own incarceration. She observes him with a detached, clinical gaze. Marco was the primary agent of his own ruin. Dante is left physically trembling, denied the absolution of the blame she refuses to project. Despising a monster is a simple cognitive task. This moral ambiguity is far more taxing. She sought a demon to eliminate, but found only a fractured man in a ruined reality. She delivers the brutal diagnosis. Marco invited the darkness. He bypassed every survival instinct for one final meal. Dante may have built the cell, but Marco voluntarily engaged the lock. One cannot engage in conflict with the decisions of the deceased. Dante searches for a non-existent absolution, while 2 hollowed-out subjects stand amongst the debris of their shared history. Dante secures the journal, emitting a spectral, dry sound. Marco actually visited that gallery 4 times. Dante knows this because he personally funded every desperate attempt to observe her. Marco considered abstract aesthetics to be high-priced nonsense. Elena's composure breaks. She recalls his somatic tell, a specific ocular twitch that signaled his performative interest for her psychological benefit. They begin to synthesize their fragmented memories into a singular portrait. The previous competitive toxicity evaporates, replaced by a permanent traumatic bond of shared bereavement and grief. She questions his intent, and Dante surveys the garden. Marco's singular objective was her insulation from reality, even if it required a formal pact with the absolute darkness to achieve it. As her hostility dissipates, it leaves a terrifying existential void. Elena discards the record and flees into the nocturnal air, attempting to escape the crushing weight of this psychological clarity. In the garden, she attempts to establish order through manual labor while her psyche collapses. Dante follows like a penitent shadow, offering an apology that carries the weight of decades. She whispers a baseline status, her hands marred by thorns. She admits to spending years formulating homicidal fantasies against him. But that specific thirst for violence has finally reached extinction. Her complex strategies for vengeance have dissolved into total neural exhaustion. Then stop, he advises softly. Simply allow the psychological burden to return to the earth. Her identity was forged in a furnace of resentment. Without that anger, she feels depersonalized. Dante extends a hand through the gloom, a mutual pact to outrun the encroaching psychological night. She scans for tactical deception, but finds only his unmasked vulnerability. She accepts the cessation of hostilities not as a romantic gesture, but as a strategic step toward stability. Chronology continues in a rhythmic domestic pulse. Between shared sustenance and manual labor, she establishes a zone of agency in his study while he calculates the historical cost. He reveals a schematic for a transparent future, drafted with cold, architectural precision. To her, it is a desperate prayer. To him, it is the final flickering of hope. He pledges to incinerate his criminal infrastructure and exit the shadows. She remains skeptical and detached, knowing 20 years of systemic violence leave a stain no ritual can purge. He rationalizes his past sociopathy as the path of least resistance. He is a hollowed-out subject, seeking a breath of air that isn't contaminated by the ghosts of his victims. She functions as the primary catalyst for his transition. He desires a paternal legacy that his offspring could examine without experiencing a reflexive sense of moral shame. Those pages confirmed that a son's loyalty can survive extreme trauma. She motivates him to proceed. It is better to drown in the unknown than stagnate in this moral swamp. He requests that she facilitate his moral recalibration. It is a radical reversal of the power dynamic, yet his emergent psychological frailty keeps her anchored to his side. The primary mandate is absolute transparency. By daybreak, the internal mechanics of his illicit empire are exposed, a complex web of lethal transactions awaiting her surgical liquidation. She navigates his corporate structures like a localized storm, neutralizing his shell companies. Dante observes with a disturbing sense of pride as she systematically erases his historical footprint. She silences the legal intermediaries with a singular, cold look. In her view, their professional masks are merely a refined facade for the filth that deserves no clinical mercy. His rationalizations collapse against her superior logic. They navigate a dangerous transition, incinerating the old world so a new, potentially pure paradigm can emerge from the debris. She acts as the stabilizing force, preventing his total ego collapse. Months pass, and as the sun sets over the garden, their collaborative effort manifests as a sanctuary. She observed the horticultural progress, but he avoids her gaze. She demands they operate as psychological equals. He merely grins, surrendering to her silent command of their shared path. The subject delivers the ultimatum: departure. The patient experiences acute separation anxiety. She seeks total autonomy, escaping his overwhelming psychological pull. She secures a sunlit residence using funds surreptitiously withheld from him. His response is suppressed rage. Her resolve is a rigid defense mechanism. The rupture is permanent. Subject A exhibits profound mourning for a lost future, his vocalizations echoing as psychic debris against her logical barriers. This interlude is merely a situational pause. Departure occurs in 14 days, post-planting. An underlying sexual tension persists like a phantom heat. Reconstitution of self requires the total rejection of his illicit wealth. They occupy a twilight space, exhibiting a double incapacity to verbalize grief. 14 days of intense physical exertion pass, He exhibits pathological overprotectiveness, demanding logistics for her minimal belongings. She views this as a final, suffocating control tactic. He insists on a final act of service. Her new 4-story sanctuary is saturated in light, representing a fragile hope for an ego finally self-governed. The door seals, the silence acts as a sensory balm. The cortisol spike vanishes. She identifies him as the catalyst for her newfound equilibrium. He rejects gratitude, viewing himself as the discarded cage. He displays rare cognitive empathy, acknowledging her resilience in surviving his toxic environment. She questions his sudden emotional transparency. His objective is her total self-sufficiency. They share a final tactile bond before she issues a symbolic directive. A melancholic expression, then exit. Subject A regresses into his vast, hollow estate. The environmental silence is experienced as a profound sensory trauma. The commercial entity's name is ironically literal. Her superior ignores her history, providing a utilitarian uniform and a cognitive reset. Labor serves as a ritualistic purification. The meager wages provide a sense of moral sanctification. Currency devoid of his criminal associations. Physical exhaustion masks her psychological trauma, yet her isolation is deafening. Despite the urban cacophony, she remains fixated on his auditory imprint. She maintains a facade of independence until his digital signature appears. Subject A displays signs of disorientation, reporting a biological failure in the garden. Her psychological defenses collapse. He describes the decay of his greenery. A man who mastered complex power dynamics is incapacitated by agricultural failure. She adopts a hostile tone to mask her vulnerability. She rationalizes her return as an act of horticultural preservation, ignoring his evident emotional disintegration. Re-entering his domain creates a temporal dissociation. He appears physically depleted, a fallen sovereign undergoing a total systemic collapse. His obsessive-compulsive order has devolved into chaotic neglect. He experiences deep humiliation as she intervenes in the ruin of their former habitat. He is buckling under psychic weight. In the garden, his air is clear, over-nurturing. He asphyxiated the roots in a desperate attempt to force growth. She exposes his destructive patterns. Subject A exhibits a total loss of ego, kneeling in despair. She initiates a shared task to reintegrate him into her reality. They engage in a familiar kinetic ritual. He displays total submissiveness, yet the surrounding organic decay reflects his internal state of terminal loneliness. He admits a complete dependency on her. She discusses future growth. He counters with a confession. The garden was always a surrogate for his fixation on her. The void between them vibrates with repressed longing. Subject A remains immobile, a discarded icon with hands stained by the earth. His internal architecture is failing. His attempts at altruism result in failure. He is systematically dismantling his power to achieve a moral transformation. She interrogates his motivations. He cites an interpersonal vow. She warns him that externalizing his motivation for change will lead to a resentful outcome. Subject manifests acute ocular calcification. The patient favors terminal ethical decontamination over further psychological incubation within the perverse sanctuary of his documented sociopathic history. She experiences vicarious suffering. She uses their progeny as a moral anchor, suggesting their connection transcends their collective history of violence. She utilizes their son as a symbol of redemptive belief. She employs humor as a defense against tears while he emerges from his prolonged depression, a fleeting positive affect. Their shared trauma creates a moment of mutual recognition, two fractured psyches acknowledging the complementary nature of their wounds. Autonomy necessitates this distance. She enforces her boundaries, returning only in the capacity of a caretaker for the vulnerable organic life. A weekly ritual establishes a stable tether. Kneeling in the nocturnal soil, they exchange fragments of their disparate cognitive realities. he describes the mechanics of coercion. She details the intellectual world of literature. These clashing narratives produce a dark, cynical humor. They find levity in the absurd. Beneath their defensive layers, their diverging trajectories find a brief, unstable harmony. This stasis persists until a crisis occurs. After 60 days, a catastrophic event fractures their carefully constructed psychological sanctuary. He displays vocal frailty, his habitual dominance gone. Her physiological response is acute. He confesses to a total systemic rot, pleading for her presence. She experiences the sensation of impending death. However, the patriarch is merely suffering a nervous breakdown. He reveals a hostile takeover. His empire is being liquidated. All illicit assets are being purged. While she sees liberation, he faces an identity crisis. A career predator, he fears becoming a non-entity without a target. Deprived of authority, his persona vanishes. She confronts him. The power was an external construct. She suggests he finally engage with his true self. He exhibits agoraphobia regarding civilian life. She offers a cold ultimatum: commit to the new reality or be consumed by the ruins of the old one. The deadline is 72 hours. He must terminate a criminal dynasty. She observes his psychological shift over the past year. He is capable of surviving the peace. The predator is seeking moral absolution. He displays a desperate need for her as a psychological anchor during this total identity transition. She desires closure, but his absolute vulnerability is a powerful emotional hook. She is effectively a hostage to her own empathy for a reformed monster. She agrees to a temporary stay. A 72-hour legal siege follows. She oversees the proceedings, ensuring his divestment is absolute and legally binding. She encourages his dormant architectural aspirations. He cites his age as a barrier to reinvention, but she rejects his stagnation. He must integrate into the world. Subject exhibits latent wanderlust. Elena maintains an external facade of detachment while internally yearning for a topographical escape devoid of residual trauma or recurring spectral associations. The terminal phase concludes on Friday. Subject liquidates 20 years of institutionalized power, emerging into the light as a hollowed shell to converge with his primary anchor. Observation of systemic collapse. Subject experiences acute sensory blunting, questioning his own psychic equilibrium, while the female counterpart displays a morbid, cynical resignation to the fallout. Release of chronic tension manifests as a manic, hollow vocalization. Elena initiates a grounding intervention, bypassed the intellectual noise to target the subject's visceral, instinctual core requirements. Subject regresses to a primal desire for domestic enclosure. Shedding his high-status armor for utilitarian garments, he attempts to find homeostasis within the literal dirt of his defunct territory. Subject verbalizes significant existential dread, yet reports a decrease in perceived environmental pressure. He displays increased postural confidence, while Elena grapples with an avoidant attachment internal conflict. The subject's affective walls fail. Despite recognizing the inherent instability of a reformed predatory personality, Elena chooses proximity, committing to a psychologically taxing path of rehabilitation. Subject displays obsessive-compulsive displacement, treating horticulture with the tactical intensity of a combat zone. Elena intervenes to deconstruct this militarized worldview, advocating for a detached, observational perspective. Introduction of art therapy as a cognitive diversion. Subject's internal acceleration finds a vent through creative expression, revealing a disturbing yet profound visual manifestation of his internal fire. The diagnostic profile of the subject evolves. His visual output captures the urban decay with a raw, unsettling accuracy that briefly fractures his stoic, pathological mask into a genuine smile. Forced social exposure. Elena facilitates a public presentation of the subject's psyche, experiencing a vicarious vulnerability as she witnesses the former predator standing entirely defenseless before the masses. A shift in fixation from the aggressor to the creator. 6 months post-collapse, a meteorological event in Brooklyn serves as the catalyst for a major emotional breakthrough. Subject remains stationary during a torrential downpour, utilizing the environment for a symbolic, ritualistic purification of his perceived moral stains, while Elena observes from a safe distance. Subjective logic fails. Both individuals succumb to a shared state of environmental immersion, occupying a singular, authentic moment that exists outside of their previous sociopathic frameworks. Subject verbalizes a repressed confession, his self-imposed isolation, rooted in a distorted sense of respect for a dead rival, collapses under the weight of his own perceived unworthiness. Subject requests absolute radical honesty. Elena experiences a dissociative freezing response, her tears masked by the rain, as she negotiates the guilt of her evolving emotional transgression, conflict between cognitive warning and emotional impulse. Elena silences the subject's self-flagellation with a desperate physical union, merging unresolved grief with a primal, starving need for connection. Cognitive reassessment complete. The subject's history is now categorized as inconsequential atmospheric debris. A singular physical contact initiates a profound shift in her neurological state, simulating a return to vitality. Construction of a new relational architecture atop a foundation characterized by severe structural instability. Equilibrium is established within the mundane rituals of heat and light, stabilizing their shared environment. Elena asserts her own agency, choosing a path of continued dissociation despite the total ruin of her former life. The pair attempts to navigate a romantic bond while filtering out the persistent shadows of their criminal lineage. The process of reconstruction is characterized by intense psychological labor, yet the resulting internal calm is documented as authentic. 1 year following the baseline event, Dante reveals the true culmination of his artistic and psychological labor. He establishes a philanthropic sanctuary, a monument to a fallen associate, functioning as a form of restorative justice. Elena integrates her own identity into his redemptive mission, seeking a practical application for their shared survival. Within the urban decay of Brooklyn, the subjects identify and preserve aesthetic value within damaged structures. Elena achieves a state of environmental belonging within the confines of their isolated, cultivated ecosystem. Narrative recollection of a traumatic event from the former street-level hierarchy. Physical markers of extreme distress. Elena's labial tremors signal a psychological proximity to total ego dissolution. Their solidified relational foundation effectively terminates the influence of random environmental variables. A 24-month interval passes. Their collaborative mission expands with a volatile, aggressive momentum. Dante presents a symbolic iron object, a functional key, consciously avoiding the traditional matrimonial signifier of a ring. This metallic token represents a secured sanctuary rather than a legal or social proxy for ownership. The bond persists, though the subject's historical transgressions remain permanently etched into his psychological profile. With every diurnal cycle, she monitors the physical and emotional scars of his ongoing penitence. Artificial illumination serves to obscure the deep, irregular patterns of their shared private suffering. By maintaining a physical grip on this cold iron reality, she manages to excavate a sense of peace. The chronic auditory hallucination of trauma modulates into a rhythmic, manageable, physiological pulse. Analyzing the debris of their former lives, they search for a final, definitive conclusion to their narrative. Within the literal and metaphorical soot of the aftermath, no ritualistic cleansing agent proves effective. A formal commitment to ascend from the ruins as the atmospheric conditions signal a final, bloody transition.